Investor Connect podcast program. This is Hall T. Martin. I'm the host of the show, in which we interview angel investors, venture capital, private equity, family offices, and many other investor groups for startups and growth companies. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for joining us. Hello, this is Hall Martin with Investor Connect. Today I'm here with Anton Golub of Flovtec. Anton, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for inviting me for the podcast.
So what was your background before joining Flovtec?
So quite interesting, actually. It was kind of started way back from kind of how my parents raised me. My father was an entrepreneur, kind of quite traditional, strict family. They identified very early on that I'm good mathematician, as in mathematics, so kind of steered me towards that path of becoming a mathematician. Then after my university, actually, I entered this exciting new space of high-frequency trading. That was way back in 2008 and 9. Kind of this intersection of technology, markets, and finance was just kind of starting to emerge into the public eye, if I can call it that way. Was very lucky to enter first on a research basis into that space. I worked in UK at a research institution on the topic of high-frequency trading. Then was recruited actually by UK government to work on providing policy recommendations, actually, and regulatory challenges in the context of this new technology. And I really loved that, but kind of really wanted to go into the financial industry in the context of high-frequency trading, and was very lucky to actually join a hedge fund in Switzerland, kind of doing my dream job, which was high-frequency trading. Yeah. And it was really, I liked it a lot. It was really my passion, and I really enjoyed it. And then way back in 2013, actually, my boss at the hedge fund, he told me, Anton, I know you love this finance, trading, technology. That's great, but that's not the future. The future is something called the blockchain, and let's do that. And way back, actually, I was 27 at that time. So that means I was young enough, unexperienced enough, and naive enough to actually say, yeah, let's do that. Let's create a startup in the industry of blockchain way back in 2013. And then together with my boss, started a company called Liquidity Corporation in Switzerland as well. And at the beginning, it was quite humble. It was just me and my partner, my boss from the hedge fund, basically two people. And then kind of the things started growing in 2015. Kind of the typical startup story. The ecosystem grew a little bit and we got some fun. Then kind of the whole thing took off. So basically from two people in 2013, January 2018, at the peak of this digital asset mania and hype, more than 200 people, offices all over the globe. So kind of the whole startup craziness, I managed to experience it. And then that was kind of where I saw it. And something very interesting kind of that I saw within the context of the blockchain space was that, if I kind of have to describe it very simply, is that in plain language, blockchain is just a global platform for assets. This is basically how I saw it, and this is how I explained it, for instance, to my father. And then if you need that kind of an analogy for that, the internet is a global platform for information. Put pictures, videos, text, documents there. So equivalent of that for assets is the blockchain. And that kind of was what I saw, something very interesting, a huge challenge, a huge problem is just because you have a blockchain, you put those digital assets there, and now they're on a trading venue. Doesn't mean you can actually do anything with them unless you have liquidity. So that means somebody who's continuously posting, buying and selling prices such that you can sell an asset or buy an asset at low transaction costs. None of that vision of the blockchain works. And then basically mid of last year, I started Flovtec, and kind of in plain language, what we are, we're a fully automated, computerized liquidity provider for digital assets on the blockchain. So this is kind of my background and my story.
Well, great. Sounds like you had quite a journey in the blockchain world and done well with it. So a lot of our listeners are investors trying to understand how to invest in this space. What would be your advice for those who want to invest in the digital asset space?
So it's actually a really, really good question. And I would just put a huge disclaimer to everyone telling them that the blockchain space and the digital asset space, it's really, really in the early stages. So therefore, kind of, people have to understand the context that a lot of the building blocks that are part of the vision of the blockchain are actually not there or just being built. Therefore, the ambitious visions and ambitious projects that young and driven people pitch to the end investors are not reasonable within the context of where we are. So kind of my advice is actually just to be quite realistic, understand that blockchain actually will change the world. This is actually how I see it. But we are really at the early stages. If I would have to kind of explain it in the context of the internet, we are just, or the computer revolution, we're basically in the 80s equivalent. Yeah. So it's really early on. A lot of things are missing. And a lot of the huge success stories that are going to come are not obvious at the moment. And to kind of, again, give an analogy, I mean, in the 80s or the 90s, you could barely anticipate that a person called Mark Zuckerberg will have a huge social media platform and he's going to be one of the wealthiest individuals on the planet, because those business models were not obvious in the 80s and 90s. So just kind of, I would really actually give caution to investors to have reasonable expectations, understand this is a revolutionary technologies, but we are in the early days for transparency.
So as we come into the early days, and how do you see the industry evolving? What do you think are going to be the next things we'll see in the next 6 or 12 months coming out of the digital asset space? And how do you think the infrastructure is going to be coming together to support all the applications people talk about?
Yeah. So I think that the first kind of big change going forward in the next year or two, maybe, is we're going to see a clarity with regards to regulation and how does this new technology fit into the old regulation, and how does new regulation emerge to embrace the benefits and of the blockchain technology. So I would say that today there's a lot of discussion between how to regulate this technology and the services offered on top of that technology. I claim that there's going to be, my opinion is that there's going to be a lot more clarity going forward. And going forward, there's not going to be any difference between unregulated or regulated services on top of the blockchain technology, because all of it will be regulated, actually. So this is just kind of how I would have to say, is that regulation is the next path that we're going to take as the members of this industry. And going forward, everything is going to be regulated, and you're going to have service providers that kind of familiar from the traditional space that are now in the blockchain space, but fully regulated. So kind of have to illustrate it. We're going to have a fully regulated blockchain or a digital asset-based bank, for instance, or a banking service providers. This is where we're going in the next year.
Well, what kind of growth rate do you think we'll see once the regulations are clear and established and everybody understands how it works? What kind of growth rate do you think we'll get out of this sector?
I think comparing to the growth, just looking at the growth rate over the last couple of years, which was absolutely spectacular, I think that with the regulatory clarity, we're going to have even greater growth going forward because of that clarity, because of understanding what are the rules of conduct. And I think going forward, people will finally understand, in certain contexts, will understand where does the technology bring immediate benefits and where it is just kind of too far out the vision lies. So I'm hugely optimistic, but also, I mean, I have to say for transparency, I'm hugely biased because I'm so deeply involved in this industry. But I anticipate a tremendous growth over the next years.
And how many companies do you think are engaged in the digital asset space now?
So I have quite a good insight into what's happening in Switzerland. And if you kind of ever read about the digital asset blockchain space, you kind of heard about the emphasis that Switzerland is the crypto paradise or the blockchain paradise. You perhaps have heard about the so-called crypto valley, which is kind of the analogy of the Silicon Valley. So I can just say actually that in Switzerland, which is a very small country within a very small actually physical space, there's thousands of blockchain companies that are involved and a lot of passionate people that have the vision of using this technology to change the world going forward. And I can say just, in the Swiss terms, there's thousands of companies here. Some are well-known, some are less well-known, some people are more publicly exposed or less. But Switzerland already is a mecca for the blockchain industry. And internationally, kind of the big hubs are Singapore, in US, in San Francisco, in New York area. In London, there's a lot of action happening, and kind of maybe in line where the broader world or the bigger picture is actually moving is actually Asia. So really, I think that all the action going forward, but in the wider context of the blockchain industry, is actually going to be Hong Kong, Singapore, all these amazing new fast-growing countries where a lot of things are going to happen.
So with all that going on, how should the investor approach the digital asset space today? What kind of investment thesis do you think would be successful?
So I would actually state that it's very important to understand that the vision of the blockchain heavily, or the digital assets heavily relies on having certain building blocks in place to enable the vision. So I'll kind of give you actually clarity here. So if we kind of think about it, if the blockchain is a platform for assets, if you want to trade them, you need to have certain items there. So kind of on the bottom layer, if I can say it like that, is in fact the infrastructure or the blockchain. So kind of this is the piping for the global marketplace of digital assets. Kind of the equivalent of that in the context of the internet is the TCP/IP protocols. So when you actually send a message on WhatsApp, kind of the piping in the background that enables that my message comes from my WhatsApp app to your WhatsApp app is actually the TCP/IP protocol. The equivalent of that in the digital asset space is the blockchain. So kind of now you have this blockchain, this digital platform for digital assets. You want somebody to tokenize or digitize assets. So that's called the tokenization entity. Yeah? So now once we have those digital assets on the blockchain, you want somebody to safeguard them or safekeep them. That's called a custodian in the traditional finance language. So now we have the blockchain, we have the infrastructure, we have the assets there, we have somebody to safeguard them. We want to onboard the end clients. So this is called a banking service provider. And once we have those end clients, they want to exchange digital assets, which is quite normal. That's called a marketplace or a digital asset exchange. And kind of the last building block within this whole ecosystem is actually liquidity provision. So this ability to exchange one asset for the other at low transaction cost. So I just described the ecosystem with its building blocks. And I think a strategic investor who understands the vision of the blockchain will try to position itself by investing into those building blocks, into high quality teams with a clear vision that then execute in building these items within the ecosystem. So this is kind of how I would try to phrase it, understanding the ecosystem, the building blocks, and then investing into the strong teams that can execute.
Great. So you mentioned the regulatory challenge and that's being sorted out, but what is the technical or the market challenge facing blockchain or digital assets today?
So I think that very few people, or maybe a bit more people who have hands-on experience working with blockchain technology, have an understanding that this blockchain and digital assets are barely workable prototypes. So this is really like, as I mentioned in the early days, if you kind of recall from your experience using a computer or the internet way back in the 90s, for instance, those things barely worked at that state. So the same progress or process is actually happening now in the space of digital assets. It's just those are barely workable prototypes that are not scalable. So that means this has to be a progress done on the hands-on level where we can achieve the goal of having scalable technologies here. So I think that's actually the next challenge that we need to address is create just technology that can sustain onboarding of millions or hundreds of millions of end clients, because this is the huge challenge in the moment, a pain point, and we need to address it going forward. So if we just have to say one technical challenge of the blockchain is just lack of scalability and not being able to deliver on that scalability.
Well, that's a good point. So in the last few minutes that we have here, what else should we cover that we haven't?
I think that we were quite thorough and your questions were quite exhaustive. So on my side, I think we covered pretty much everything that I would like to mention.
Well, great. So how best for listeners to get back in touch with you?
Best way to get in touch with me is via LinkedIn, on Twitter. So these are pretty much the two medias that I'm trying to use. So they can feel free to reach out to me, send me a message, and I'm quite responsive and happy to get in touch with anyone who's interested to learn more about Flow Technologies and its role in the space of digital assets.
Well, great. Well, we'll put those in the show notes and want to thank you for your time and hope to have you back for a follow-up soon.
My pleasure, and thanks very much for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Investor Connect helps investors interested in startup funding. In this podcast series, experienced investors share their experience and advice. You can learn more at investorconnect.org. Paul T. Martin is the director of Investor Connect, which is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to the education of investors for early-stage funding. All opinions expressed by Hall and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of Investor Connect. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.